Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and this is the third video in a series about overall strategy in Arkham Horror the card game. As usual, this series is a deep dive into the mechanics of the game. What are the specific challenges that the game presents to the players? As I've learned more about what the game asks you to do and how to do it, I've found that the game is less frustrating and I've had more fun and won more often. I hope that after watching these videos, you'll also get better at thinking about the challenges in the game and how the investigators you play and the cards you put in your deck can meet those challenges. First, let's review. In the first video, we outlined the three main challenges in the game: beating the Doom Clock, passing skill tests, and managing your resources. Then we discussed action compression and extra actions as the main mechanism for not falling behind in the game. Next, we focused on making those actions count by actually passing skill tests. Today, we'll focus on the third challenge, the final one, which is managing your resources. If you don't have cards in hand, and you can't play them, then you won't be able to face the other challenges we've talked about. The game itself knows this, and while you need to balance your own deck around being able to play your cards, you also need to consider that the game will take your cards and resource tokens away from you, and will speed up your demise by dealing you damage and horror. First, what is a resource? This video goes beyond just talking about the resource tokens themselves, which are used to pay for cards. Some people call this economy, but I define a resource as anything you can stockpile and spend for some kind of benefit. For example, cards are a type of resource. Once in hand, they give you lots of options about how to play your turn. And if they're not useful this turn, they may be useful next turn. Next, of course, are resource tokens themselves. They are used to pay for most assets and events, and can be used for boosting your skill value with talents or for some other game effects. Unlike cards, there is no limit to how many you can have. Your health and sanity is also a resource. We'll talk about how you can spend it later, but unlike cards and resource tokens, if you run out, you'll be defeated. We won't talk about this anymore in the video, but managing your assets that have charges or ammo or secrets or supplies or whatever is another part of the game. There's not much to say. If your gun runs out of ammo, you either need to play another gun or refill it using another player card. How often this happens, it depends on your player count and how many enemies you end up fighting. Actions are another sort of resource in that you do spend them, but they do get reset each turn, so you can't save them up. We've already talked ad nauseum about action economy in the first video, so there's no need to go into this more here. It's worth saying that stockpiling your economy does not do too much by itself. While there are cards that reward you for having 15 or 20 or more resources sitting in your token pool, you really want to spend the resources you have. That's how you get ahead in the game, using your cards for powerful effects. So the focus here is about being able to afford what effects you want, and building your resources back up once you've lost them. Now, we've all been there. In the middle of the game, you'll say things like, "I wish I had more money to play my cards," or "I just need another few cards first." This is bound to happen in a game where the cards you draw come out in a random order. So don't feel bad if this is you, but if this is you in almost every game, then you need to think a little bit more carefully about your deck building and your gameplay. So why focus on managing resources? Indeed, every deck has different resource needs. It's up to you to first determine what kinds of cards you want in your deck, and then think about their costs. There's certainly an allure to the big expensive cards. A Dynamite Blast can certainly accomplish a lot, but you'll have to cough up 5 resources to play it. Now, that's not a reason to shy away from expensive cards, it's just a reason to make sure your deck can afford it. Well, maybe your deck has a lot of skill cards, or event cards which don't cost you any resources. But then you'll likely need a lot of ways to draw cards to replenish your skills. Having not enough resources available often results in drawing a single card or taking a single resource, which will slow you down. Even worse, if you're engaged with an enemy and can't afford to play your cards to deal with that enemy, you might have to take an attack of opportunity just to get yourself out of the mess. Finally, the game will take your resources away. Treacheries drawn from the encounter deck most commonly make you take damage or horror, discard cards from your hand or play area, or lose resources or actions. If you need to quickly recover, you'll need to use strong resource cards to do so. So let's talk about how to evaluate your deck's needs. First off, having resources at the start of the game is paramount. The first turn is when you need to put down assets that will help you do your job and give you an excellent return for the rest of the game. Good thing you always start with 5 cards and 5 resources. But that might not be enough. Think about it this way. What do you need to do to perform your role in the team? If you're a fighter, you need a weapon as soon as possible. This one will cost you 4 resources. If you have 4 combat, this will put you at a skill value of 5. That's okay at the beginning of a campaign, but not really good enough to feel confident using a limited use weapon. So maybe you'll think about putting down a beat cop to put you at 6 combat. But now we're looking at 8 resources on turn 1. That's possible, but difficult. An emergency cache for your first action, followed by playing these 2 assets, will set you up very nicely, provided you've drawn them all in your opening hand. Compare this to, say, Daisy Walker, who already has 5 intellect and can get to 6 skill value just by slapping down a magnifying glass for just 1 resource and not even an action. She can perform her role of getting clues cheaply and quickly. While this may seem a little unfair to our cash-strapped guardians, the point is that in our example, Daisy has a lot more wiggle room in her economy to play other things, like a tome or 2. Some more general advice. While you're building your deck, take a look at your general plan for how you're going to perform your role. Estimate how many assets you need in play at once. Do you need a few spells out and an ally? Total up their costs. Then think about the cost of the events you expect to need to play. Not every event is necessary, of course, but if you expect to deal damage with I've got a plan, you'll need to hang on to 3 resources for when the time comes. There are a few other uses of resources, like the skill boosts, physical training, and hyper-awareness. And once you've made a rough estimate of the total, think about if your deck can generate that number, including the starting 5 resources and 1 more each upkeep phase. I've read that some people like to just total up the average cost of the cards in their entire deck and go from there, but I don't think that this is an exact science. The average cost doesn't really take into consideration that you don't usually play multiple copies of the same card, and expensive cards in your deck require that you can spike your resource generation. You might have a lot of cheap cards in your deck, but Dynamite Blast doesn't do anything until you can play it. So I would make sure you can play your cards right away, rather than waiting for your 1 resource every upkeep for 5 rounds. Next, we've talked about the resource cost side of things, but you also need to make sure your deck can find the crucial cards quickly. If you have a lot of redundancy, you might not need much card draw. But if you need something in particular, try adding card draw or search effects, something we'll get into later. Along those lines, if you're playing an event or skill-heavy deck, make sure you compensate for that by including more card draw. If you're planning on playing more than one event or using more than 1 skill per round, the 1 card at the end of upkeep isn't going to cut it. Let's take a look at the level 0 versions of a Zoe and Rex deck that I played through the Dunwich Legacy on the channel. This video isn't exactly about deck building as a whole, and I don't want to pretend that these decks are optimized. They're just simple decks, and I wanted to talk to you about a little bit about why I included the cards I did with regard to managing my resources for each. First, let's talk about Zoe herself. She already has a built-in way to gain resources. Every time she becomes engaged with an enemy, she gains 1 resource. While this is a great ability, there's 2 reasons why I mostly ignore it here in 2-player. First, I want to be able to play my cards before enemies show up. Second, Zoe's Cross has a way to spend that 1 resource. It converts to 1 automatic damage. Okay, my plan for this deck is to play an ally and any of my weapons within the first 2 turns. My weapons cost 3 or 4 resources, and so do my allies. So my preference is to draw emergency cash or stand together early enough so I can afford it all. If there's nothing else to do, I don't mind taking a resource action, but the deck could have used a second copy of Stand Together. My events like Get Over Here and 1-2 Punch are great, but I think I can afford them later on as I get resources passively. As far as card draw goes, I'm not too concerned. I don't have a preference for which weapon or ally I draw. and at the very least, I do have the 2 copies of Glory. Finally, I do have 1 copy of Liquid Courage to heal horror just in case, but I expect to put most of the damage and horror onto my allies. Let's move on to Rex Murphy. He has fewer assets, but they aren't necessarily cheap. My plan is to have lockpicks in play just to trigger Rex's ability once every turn. If I don't find it, I'm not too worried because I think I can pass most tests anyway with a magnifying glass and Dr. Milan Christopher, who, by the way, will make me enough money to afford the lockpicks if I get it later. All 3 of those cards only cost me 8 resources total. That said, I might want to dump my X-Source resources into Hyper Awareness, so I'm including extra resource generation in Burning the Midnight Oil. I also have a lot of cheap events and skills. I have enough card draw in Preposterous Sketches and Search for the Truth to get me by as well. Since Rex won't be dealing with enemies so much, I don't expect him to take much by the way of damage or horror, but will make good use of that 9 sanity with Ward of Protection. As you can see, for both of these decks, the resource generation does not dominate the deck, but simply makes the decks function. Okay, deck building is one thing, playing is another. I'd recommend prioritizing playing card draw and resource generation early, like the first turn, and barring that, holding the cards until you have a spare action. This will really smooth out your other turns. Most decks should try to sit on 2 to 3 resources and at least have many cards in hand. Most events in particular cost about 2 resources, so if you're always able to play them, you'll be incredibly efficient. Now, taking the resource action can be necessary in play, but not ideal. If this is the turn to put out a weapon, take the opportunity to do so. If you wait for upkeep to gain that 4th resource necessary to play a gun, you might end up drawing an enemy on the next turn, and now you don't have a weapon. While upgrading, don't cut your resource generating cards unless you're upgrading to cheaper versions of the cards you already have. Resource generation itself is rare in higher level cards, so be careful here. Next game you might not draw all of your cards in the same order, and you might hurt for resources. Okay, now we're going to talk about gaining resource tokens themselves, and a good chunk of cards that let you do so efficiently. I'll talk about the type of card, and then give you 3 examples of cards, but there are many others you could pick. The gold standard for gaining many resources at once is, of course, Emergency Cash. It's a neutral card, so anyone can take it, and whatever you take instead needs to outperform it. In general, you need this kind of effect if you have many cards that cost 3 or 4 resources. If you're asset heavy, make sure you include 2 copies of this card. Well, what's better than gaining 3 resources? How about gaining 7 resources? This kind of obscene resource generation is limited to rogues, but they can make the most of it with cards that care about how many resources they have, or others that are just plain expensive. The team-friendly version of Emergency Cash is Stand Together. In total, this gains 4 resources, 2 for you and 2 for someone else. While it's nice for you, it's even better for them, since they didn't have to spend any cards or actions. The next way of gaining resources is when it's combined with some other kind of action. Burning the Midnight Oil is especially efficient since you probably were going to investigate most turns anyways. Kicking the Hornet's Nest does a lot of things. It'll get you an enemy, a clue, and some number of resources. It can be a little dangerous, but now you have some resources to deal with the problem you created. Lastly, we have Act of Desperation, which lets you toss away an item asset in a hand slot to fight an enemy and potentially gain some resources in the process. It's not exactly a traditional resource generating card, but it will help you afford another gun if the one you have out is empty. Next, we have some cards that combine a play action with some resource reduction. This isn't exactly the same as gaining resources because the resources must be used for a particular type of card, but they are just as good in the decks that have a lot of these cards. First up, we have Uncage the Soul, which is good for helping play any kind of spell or ritual. Next, Library Docent picks up a tome you have in play to put down a different one for 2 resources cheaper. Finally, Old Book of Lore level 3 lets you immediately play any card you found for a 2 resource discount. Pretty good. Lastly, we have the passive resource generation cards, which is certainly the most efficient way to be able to afford to play other cards. Lone Wolf is an auto-include if you're playing solo, but even with 2 or 3 investigators, you should be able to trigger it often enough for it to pay itself off. It's hard to talk about passive economy without mentioning Dr. Milan Christopher again, who gains you a resource for doing exactly what you're going to do anyways, which is investigate. The taboo list wisely suggests we limit this to just 1 time per round. Finally, let's consider Gregory Gry, who can net gain you about 6 resources as long as you succeed by enough on a few skill tests. For some higher level cards, well, Edge of the Earth also released level 3 talents that help you pay for cards too. There are 5 of them, but these 2 are the most widely useful in my opinion. Crafty lets you pay for Insight, Tool, and Trick cards, and Prophetic does the same for Fortune, Spell, and Spirit cards. Since these cards also help you pass skill tests, they're not a bad upgrade if you're thinking about taking out level 0 resource generation cards. Okay, let's move on to talking about card draw. This is a card game after all, so drawing cards will always get you to your best cards faster. Of course, as we talked about, cards help with action compression and with passing skill tests, so you do need cards. And drawing only 1 card during upkeep isn't enough for nearly all decks. The best way to find cards you need, though, are by using search effects or by digging through the discard pile. So we'll talk about those too. If you're looking for cards that draw cards, you need to draw at least 2 and usually 3. Remember that you have to spend a card from your hand too, so with something like Preposterous Sketches, you're only netting 2 cards in hand. Some people say that Preposterous Sketches could have just been something else better itself. I think that's not that big of a deal though, since you'll have to fill out a deck of 30 cards and they can't all be winners. Here's the Mystic version. There aren't too many deck filtering effects, so even if you have to discard a card, I think this card is pretty useful. The super version of Preposterous Sketches is Cryptic Research. For 4 XP, the cost is now 0, the card is fast, and you can use it on anyone. This effect is really strong. Let's think about the theoretical difference between searching for a card and drawing many cards. If you're a deck that is fairly indiscriminate about which cards you draw because you're playing a big hand deck, or use up a lot of events or skills, then something like Preposterous Sketches is great. But for most decks that have a key card or combo, searching for a single card is better. Mr. Rook is great because he can look pretty deep into your deck for the card you need right now, and taking a weakness immediately is often a good thing because it won't surprise you. Even with the taboo list, which makes the ability cost an action, Mr. Rook can really do a lot for you. It's also worth saying that Seeker has a few other cards that trigger off of searching your deck too. Anyways, searching for 1 card is great. Backpack level 2 lets you search for 3 cards out of the top 12. They have to be items or supplies, but most decks want a good number of those right away. Cards like these also help thin your deck, so your natural draws during upkeep are slightly more predictable. Okay, back to Seeker cards. 5 XP is a lot, but finding any card for anyone, that's pretty incredible. Essentially, this is another copy of whatever is the best card in your deck. Or if you've already found that card, it's another copy of the next best card. Well, if you like looking through your deck and picking out whichever card you want, you'll like the Survivor archetype of digging through your discard pile. Scrounge for supplies isn't quite no stone unturned, but being able to pick out whichever level 0 card you want is a nice effect if you'd like to reuse cards. Resourceful is similar, but can be any level card as long as it's a Survivor card. It also won't cost you an action. And finally, True Survivor lets you pick up 3 innate skills from the discard. We've talked about how playing skill-heavy decks require you to build in some card draw to refill your hand already. This card solves that problem in one fell swoop. And just like we talked about passive resource generation, there's also passive card draw. Rabbit's Foot is a nice consolation prize for failing skill tests. Again, you might have thrown a skill card at a test in the hopes of passing, but if you didn't pass, you get to draw another card. Failing a skill test isn't that great though, but Grizzly Totem level 3 draws you a card if you pass the test instead. And finally, we have Lucky Cigarette Case level 3, which combines a few of the things we talked about. After you succeed a test by one or more, you get to draw a card, but provided you've succeeded by enough, you'll get to search for exactly the card you want. Let's move on to the last type of resource, health and sanity. Unlike other types of resources, these don't get replenished automatically. At the end of the round, the game lets you draw a card and gain a resource for free, but you don't get healed. So, what is your health and sanity used for? Well, they're used for ignoring or failing to deal with enemies or treacheries. Think of it this way. If I have 9 health, I'm not going to worry about passing skill tests on treacheries that deal me damage. Anything I might have used for those tests, I'll put forward to something else, and I'll tank the damage. Of course, the amount of damage or horror on you doesn't matter until it does. Treacheries and enemies usually deal you damage or horror in chunks of up to 2, so try to have enough left to absorb a surprise hit at the end of the game. Now, you can regain your health or sanity by healing, but most healing in the game, especially at level 0, is very slow. The time you spend healing could be used instead to just end the game more quickly. We will see a few good healing cards in a minute though. Generally, it's recommended to place damage or horror onto assets or allies instead. This is called soak. Of course, it does not stop direct damage or horror, so there is definitely a place for healing in the game, and I will likely have another video about healing specifically. So let's see a few cards of how you can manage your health and sanity. First, you can spend it for some powerful effects, like Ward of Protection. This is recommended if you have a total of 8 or 9 sanity, or if you have some horror soak sitting around. Next, you can just flat out ignore or cancel damage or horror. Perseverance is a great example of protecting you from the horror or damage that actually matters. Then there's outright healing. You're only going to want to consider cards that can heal you for 2 damage and or horror for an action. Second Wind does this and draws you a card, which is pretty good. Finally, there are some cards that care about how much damage or horror you have on you, or your remaining health or sanity. Meat Cleaver gives you a bonus to your combat if you only have 3 remaining sanity. It also gives you a way to heal horror, and for good measure, it gives you a way to take horror as well. Let's wrap things up. I'm going to talk about 3 cards for each class that help you manage your resources in more than one way. I find that as the card pool has gotten bigger, it's harder and harder to justify deck slots on cards that only do one thing. Thankfully, there are some fantastic cards that help out on at least 2 of the 3 facets of your resources that we've talked about today. First, the Guardian cards. The upgraded Stand Together not only gains you and a friend resources, but also draws you 2 cards. Level 2, I've Had Worse, is fast, cancels damage or horror, and gains you 2 resources. Lastly, Hollowed Mirror comes with 3 Soothing Melodies, which give you a great return on healing and draws you a replacement card. These Seeker cards really lean into the support archetype. Surgical Kit does take 2 actions, but you can heal 3 damage and 1 horror from yourself and draw a card. It can also be combined with other kinds of healing cards, such as Alchemical Distillation. There are a lot of customizable options, but this card can heal horror, damage, and as you can see on the front, gain you resources and cards. Finally, the upgraded Archive of Conduits is unlimited healing. Anyone, anywhere, gets healed and draws a card, and sometimes they get healed for 2 and draw 2 cards. Alright, the Rogue class is a bit more selfish. Pickpocketing level 2 is passive resource generation. After you evade an enemy, you'll get a resource or card, or sometimes both. For Easy Mark, you'll get resources and cards as well, especially if you chain them together. There's no current way for rogues to heal damage from investigator cards, but they do have Liquid Courage to heal horror. If you succeed, you'll also get a card. If not, you'll heal another horror at the cost of a card. Still very efficient. Mystics have all sorts of fun, expensive tools. There's more passive card and resource generation that we've seen before, and there's also some healing. Let's take a closer look at Deny Existence level 5. How does the game often try to screw you over? By taking away your cards, resources, actions, health, or sanity. Not only do you get to ignore that, you get to do the opposite. Probably not going to be anything to rely upon, but it is a great way to keep the game from messing with you. Finally, let's look at a few survivor cards. Take Heart gets you 2 cards and 2 resources, as long as you can find a test you're sure you'll fail. That's a lot out of 1 card, but nothing left to lose can be even more. If it's the last card in your hand and you have no resources, you can draw back up to 5 and gain 5 resources. Again, this is a great way to recover after a devastating treachery, or just after you've played all of your cards in a turn. Finally, either Precious Memento is Soak and Healing in 1 card. It should keep you alive for the rest of the game. Some final thoughts as usual. Don't underestimate your deck's need for resources. The cards can be somewhat boring, but they really do help out on your overall play. And if you find yourself with tons of extra resources, think about upgrading into something fancy that is expensive. Next, the best cards are the ones that gain multiple types of resources at once. Even upgrading Emergency Cash to level 2 version, which draws you a card in addition to the 3 resources, is an excellent choice. And finally, your resources are meant to be used. There are no extra points for ending a scenario with full health, so make sure you use all of your investigator strengths, whether that's tanking a lot of hits or handing out cards to everyone on your team. That's the end of this strategy guide, and we're done with this particular series that focuses on the challenges the game throws at you. Hope this has been a useful look at how to get ahead in the game and not get frustrated by some of the obstacles. My next series will focus on choosing investigators, building a competent team, and deck building. In the meantime, feel free to check out some of my other Arkham Horror videos here on the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.